Hey folks, and welcome back to another episode of Straight Talk Whiskey. I'm Nick, here with you as always. Thanks for joining us for episode number 100. So we finally made that milestone, and today we've got a really decent entry level, if you will, single malt scotch from the Speyside region of Scotland in the Glenfiddich 12-year-old. So, since I usually forget about price, I'll just start off right off the bat that I picked this up locally for about $39.99 before the state and local governments took their relatively high taxes in addition. So what we've got here is a 12-year-old single malt whiskey, as I already said, which is aged in very fine olorosso sherry and bourbon casks and blended, matured together, or vatted, if you will. So Glenfiddich is owned by the William Grant and Sons Company, and they've been around for a while. So when I'm talking about, this old style of family-owned distillery, that is not what we would refer to now as craft or something like that, where you think of like a small-scale operation, this whole grassroots movement, that sort of thing. But what you have here is something that has held on to that family tradition, and yes, certainly they've gone and expanded their portfolios to other whiskeys and spirits, things like Hendrick's and Tullamore Dew and that sort of thing. But Glenfiddich, getting started in the late 1800s by the Grant family, it changed hands and has gone through a number of different people that have overlooked the whiskey, not just master distillers, as some people like to make a chronology of their history, but things like Stillman, Copperman, people who are managing the warehouses, that sort of thing. There's all a deep sense of history connected with all that, which is interesting. If you want to check out their website, they've got a good bit on the story behind the whiskey. But they were still pumping out whiskey right after Prohibition, when it was only Glenfiddich and about 5 other people that were still making Scotch whiskey at the time. So they've stuck it out through thick and thin, and they're arguably one of the biggest names in Scotch today. And it's not only just the 12-year-old, which, yes, for $39.99 is pretty inexpensive for a single malt Scotch whiskey of that price range, but they also have some really fantastic versions in their 18 and some older things, 21. I think there's a 25 out there. And at one point, a few years ago, they had the oldest selling Scotch whiskey, which was about 64 years, I think. I don't know. Some others may have crept up and taken that record now, but as of that point in history, they had released the oldest and most expensive in a different whiskey, which I found was interesting. So it's not only, this lower end, but also the higher end, and they filled in the gaps in between, such like other distilleries are doing now with their experimental ranges and that sort of thing. A little bit harder to find, certainly for me, but I'll definitely be exploring those more. There's so many distilleries out there that are doing really fantastic things, and it's hard to just cover all the things that they're doing. But I've pointed this out before, and I needed to point it out again, that when people think craft whiskey, like I said, they think of the smaller, family-owned, where, they started from nothing and everybody's got these stories, and that's great and fantastic in its own right. But you also have these other distilleries, people like Johnny Walker, who really was started out by offering people something better, offering the people at those times something that was consistent and of high quality. And so you have to keep in the back of your mind, if you know already, or go out and educate yourself about these brands, that they're not just these huge corporate entities with no, personality or humanity to them. Everybody's got a story, and I think it's important that we check those out, because if we don't, then we tend to lead towards purchasing only the craft stuff, which maybe isn't so craft. Maybe they're sourcing whiskey from somewhere and they're not being transparent about it, or they're saying that they use the heavenly water of Christ right, to cut their spirit after distillation, or cut it down to proof, or they're maturing it in the finest of oaks, or they're filtering through beautiful limestone, or all these different things, which are great if they're true, but some of them they get a little bit out there. So I would just keep in mind that it's not just the little guys who are making the really innovative things, but it's also these bigger brands that are still producing quality. And to be honest, their popularity is being able to drive that cost down to you, the consumer, you and I. So when you look at people like Hudson Whiskey, when they started out, you could get a 375 milliliter bottle for the same price that you could get, Glenfiddich 750 milliliter. And I'm talking about like the 18-year-old. Yeah, because some of them out there were selling for, $65, $70 when it started, and now they're starting to come down a little bit. They still have that high cost. So anyway, that's just my 2 cents on that. I believe that's given this enough time to open up. It's only the second glass that I've poured of this. So what I've come to learn is that the first 2 glasses that you may have of something may be totally different from, when your bottle is down halfway to even, a quarter of the way empty, or a quarter full at that point. So it's really important that you give it some time. You don't want too much time. You don't want to set your glasses out overnight and come back to it the next day after work. That might be a little bit too extreme. But just to give it time to breathe, give the oxygen some time to mix around there with the aromas and the flavors in the glass, and you'll have a little bit better experience. You may be able to pull a little bit more than just some of the base layer notes and alcohol scents that you're going to get off of there. So anyway, let's look at the color. I know I didn't say this, but it's bottled at 40% ABV. I always prefer a little bit higher, but after tasting this, it's not too bad of a knock at it. So looking at the color, it's a nice honey yellowish straw, little gold tint to it. It does have the green bottle, which is pretty noticeable of Glenfiddich if you were to rip this label off and just look at this bottle that's got a sort of triangular shape, and it juts out here. I don't know if you can see that on the camera if you haven't touched one of these bottles before, but it has a very distinct shape to it and look. In terms of caramel coloring, I'm not quite sure if they do or not. I can't say, but since it's been aged in olorosso casks as well as ex-bourbon casks, I do believe that some of that flavor would impart the color that I'm seeing here, and looks a little bit more towards that end of the spectrum than it would be caramel colorant. On top of that, there's also the green bottle, which is usually indicative that the color may be a little more transparent than typically you would see on the shelves with a Scotch whiskey. And this whole goes back to the thing, if people see more color, they think that it's a higher quality because it is aged more. The wood has imparted more color into the whiskey, and that's sort of a failed notion, but it gets used because it's such a prominent selling point for people who maybe aren't as experienced as most of you who might be watching this. So anyway, that's it for the color. Let's go in for the nose. Now, I absolutely love the nose on this, and similar to some other Speysides, but it's got some distinctive characteristics that set it apart from others. So you get this really soft, fruity, mellow, straw, heather. I'm even getting some fruits like watermelon, ripe raspberries, a little bit of blueberry in there. But it's just a really fragrant, fruity note. And definitely the influence of the sherry cask comes through more than the bourbon casks do on this. But Just a really fantastic, soft, sweet, comforting, some bakery, fruit pastries are coming through. Just really wonderful. Let's go in for the taste. Interestingly enough, if you've ever had redbreast before, you'll notice that there's this really deep, almost heaviness to the center of the tongue when you take a first sip that seems to hold this really rich, flavorful, thick, sherry fruit notes. And that's what I'm getting on this. It's a mixture of the sherry note that leans a little towards strawberry end of the spectrum, like strawberry pastry. It's so noticeable every time you take a sip that it just seems like a pool fills up in the center of your mouth with this really punchy, fruity flavor. The sweetness is similar to like a fruity bubble gum. It's really sugary, sweet in nature, and then it falls off the edge and you get a little bit of roundness with the bourbon cask influence, imparting some of that vanilla note that I think helps it out. It certainly helps out the maltiness with that, because the two really go well together on this. It sort of rounds out the edge. You've got like this pool of the sherry fruity notes that I talked about, and then it overflows into a nice cascade of vanilla and malted barley notes, which is really fantastic. One thing to make a point about it is that it's extremely palatable, or it's going to be extremely palatable to a lot of different people with various experiences with whiskey. So, compared to something like a Lefroy or Ardbeg, or something with a little bit higher proof that's going to give a little bit more of a bite to it in terms of pepperiness, or maybe even the alcohol content itself, this does not. This just gets you right into the flavors that it was meant, to impart to the consumer. And you don't get any of that bite. And so why that's a good thing, in the sense that you get more people that can enjoy it. It doesn't, in my opinion, need a ton of water. So that's why you see I don't have any water here to add to this. But the downside of that, because there always has to be sort of this yin and yang give and take there, is that the finish is not overly long. It's in an instant, it vanishes. It's there for the moment. For what it is, it's fantastic, but it's just a really short finish. Even right now, I can't even get any of the lingering taste from it. It's just gone. So, that is an interesting note. On the whole, this makes a really nice, if you were to put this sort of in a time of day where you might want to have this, is right after dinner, maybe alongside a dessert that you're having, preferably something that is along the fruitier sense, because I think that would pair really well with it. I'm not sure how it would stand up to something more chocolatey or nutty in note, but definitely something along the more fruity pastries and that sort of thing, it may pair really well with. So, for that's it for episode number 100. For a score, we're going to say a 90 out of 100 for what that's worth to folks at home who are keeping score. So, as always, if you're going to drink responsibly, and we'll see you next time.